Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're heading to Africa, but not for a safari or anything like that.
Right.
We're diving into how Russia is becoming a major player in this rapidly changing continent.
Yeah.
And we've got a ton of reports, analyses, even some firsthand accounts to unpack what's really going on.
Sounds good.
So imagine this, a continent just overflowing with resources. Oil, gas, gold, you name it.
Yeah.
And a population of 1.4 billion people with economies that are, on the rise.
For sure.
It's no wonder that all the global powers are, vying for influence there. And Russia is certainly making their presence known.
It's not just about the resources, though.
Okay.
Russia's strategy is much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
They're playing a long game,
Okay.
drawing on historical ties and positioning themselves as a reliable partner to these African nations.
Okay. So let's start with that history then.
Sure.
You mentioned Russia's playing a long game. How far back does this actually go?
And they'll think back to the Soviet era. Moscow was heavily involved in supporting liberation movements across Africa during their struggles against colonialism.
Right.
Countries like Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, they all received a lot of support from the USSR.
Mm.
And this wasn't just about providing weapons and military training either.
Okay.
The Soviets invested in education, infrastructure, even cultural exchange programs.
Wow.
They were really building a reservoir of goodwill that Russia is now tapping into.
So it's like they're picking up where the Soviets left off, but with kind of a modern twist.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how they're framing themselves in this new era.
Okay.
Instead of promoting communist ideology, they're emphasizing mutual respect, non-interference in internal affairs, and a partnership based on shared interests.
Okay.
It's a message that resonates with a lot of African leaders
Mm-hmm.
who are wary of Western influence and looking for different alliances.
So there's like a diplomatic charm offensive happening.
Yeah.
But it's not all just talk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got these reports here about Russia's growing military presence in Africa.
Absolutely.
Hello?
While Russia's promoting themselves as this peaceful partner, they're also the top arms supplier to the continent.
Oh, wow.
Almost half of all weapons imports.
Okay.
So it's a key part of their strategy to gain some leverage and secure their interests.
Wow. Half of all arms imports. That's huge.
It is.
What kind of weapons are we talking about here, and who are the main recipients?
It's a wide range, everything from small arms and ammunition to sophisticated fighter jets and missile systems.
Oh.
Algeria, Egypt, Sudan are some of the biggest buyers of Russian weaponry.
Okay.
But they're also supplying arms to countries facing internal conflicts and insurgencies.
And then there's that Wagner Group, this private military company we keep hearing about.
Yes, the Wagner Group is a fascinating and controversial aspect of Russia's presence in Africa.
Yeah.
They've been active in several hotspots, including Mali, the Central African Republic, and Libya, providing security services, training local forces, even engaging in combat operations.
And from what we've read, they're not just offering security services, right? They're often securing lucrative resource contracts in return for their services.
Yeah, that's a common perception, and there's evidence to support it.
Okay.
In the Central African Republic, for example, the Wagner Group has been linked to mining operations in exchange for their security services. It raises concerns about exploitation and whether Russia is truly committed to Africa's long-term development.
So we've got the historical ties, the charm offensive, and the military angle. What about the economic side of things, though?
Okay.
What's Russia doing to kind of secure its economic interests in Africa?
They're making strategic economic moves,
Okay.
focusing on key sectors like mining, energy, and agriculture.
Okay.
They're investing in projects to extract resources like diamonds, gold, uranium, and they're involved in oil and gas exploration and production.
We also came across some reports of Russia offering debt relief to certain African nations.
Right.
How does that fit into their overall strategy?
Right. Debt relief can be a really powerful tool of diplomacy.
Yeah.
It allows Russia to position itself as a benevolent partner while at the same time gaining leverage over indebted nations.
Yeah.
It's a way to build goodwill and influence political decisions.
It sounds like Russia is really pulling out all the stops to kind of secure its interests in Africa.
Yeah.
But why are African nations so receptive to this new partnership? What's driving their decision-making?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
One factor is this growing disillusionment with traditional Western powers.
Okay.
Many African nations feel exploited by past colonial relationships, and they view Western aid and investment as coming with strings attached.
Oh, okay.
So they see Russia as a counterbalance to Western influence,
Right.
a partner that respects their sovereignty and offers a different model of engagement.
So it's about seeking alternatives and diversifying their partnerships on the world stage.
Exactly.
It's not just about turning away from the West, but also about embracing a multipolar world where power is distributed more evenly.
Exactly. African nations want a seat at the table,
Mm-hmm.
and they see Russia as a partner that can help them achieve that goal.
Okay.
They're not just passively accepting Russian influence either.
Right.
They're strategically leveraging these relationships to advance their own interests.
This all sounds really complex with a lot of moving parts.
It is.
How can we kind of make sense of this on a more practical level?
Sure.
What are some specific examples of how this is playing out in different African countries?
Let's start with the Central African Republic, where the Wagner Group's role has been particularly prominent.
Okay.
The Central African Republic is a really interesting case study.
Okay.
It's a country rich in resources like diamonds and gold, but it's also been plagued by instability and conflict for years.
All right.
And this is where the Wagner Group really stepped in and became a key player.
From what I understand, they've been instrumental in supporting the current government
Right.
and helping them regain control over parts of the country that were held by rebel groups.
Mhm.
But at what cost?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
There are concerns about human rights abuses committed by the Wagner Group
Right.
and allegations that they're profiting from the country's resources in exchange for their security services.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex situation where security interests are intertwined with economic motivations,
Yeah.
and it's difficult to disentangle the two.
It raises concerns about whether Russia's involvement is truly benefiting the people of the Central African Republic,
Yeah.
or if it's simply furthering their own geopolitical and economic interests.
Right.
Right.
Let's move on to Mali.
Okay.
This is another country where Russia has significantly increased its influence,
Okay.
particularly after the withdrawal of French troops in 2021.
Yeah, I remember that
Yeah.
France had been leading a counterterrorism operation in Mali for years,
Mm-hmm.
but their presence became increasingly unpopular.
Right?
And the Malian government decided to kind of pivot towards Russia.
Exactly. Russia saw an opportunity to fill the void left by France and quickly stepped in to provide military support, training, and equipment to the Malian armed forces.
Okay.
They've also been active in providing support to the Wagner Group's operations in the country.
So Mali is a clear example of how Russia is capitalizing on shifting alliances and anti-Western sentiment in Africa.
Yes, definitely. Now, this brings us to Sudan, which is arguably the most strategically significant location where Russia is trying to establish a foothold.
I'm particularly interested in this
Okay.
because we read about Russia's ambition to build a naval base on Sudan's Red Sea coast.
Mhm.
That sounds like a major development with potential ramifications for global trade and naval power dynamics.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. This is a significant development, but it's also a very fluid situation.
Okay.
Russia has been courting Sudan for years, providing them with military aid and economic assistance. In return, Sudan has granted Russia access to Port Sudan, which is strategically located on the Red Sea, a vital shipping route for global trade.
So it's not just about military power projection, it's also about securing access to critical trade routes and strengthening Russia's economic influence in the region.
Precisely. However, there's a major complication to all of this.
Okay.
The ongoing civil war in Sudan.
Yes. The
Yeah.
conflict that erupted in 2023 has really destabilized the country
Yeah.
and created a lot of uncertainty about Russia's future plans there.
Exactly. The civil war has made it very difficult for Russia to move forward with their plans for a naval base.
Right.
And it's unclear how the situation will play out in the long term.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even the most carefully crafted strategies can be upended by unexpected events.
It's fascinating how these specific cases highlight the opportunities and challenges that Russia faces in its pursuit of influence in Africa. They're clearly making progress in some areas.
Yeah.
But they're also encountering setbacks and facing a lot of competition.
Right.
Speaking of competition, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is China. They're also a major player in Africa, and their approach is quite different from Russia's.
Yeah.
We've read a lot about China's massive investments in infrastructure, trade, and development projects across Africa.
Yeah. They're really going for it.
How does Russia's strategy compare to China's? And are they competing or cooperating in this new scramble for influence?
It's a complex relationship with elements of both competition and cooperation.
Okay.
On the one hand, they're both vying for influence and access to resources,
Right.
but they're also finding ways to work together in certain areas.
Okay.
For example, they've cooperated on some infrastructure projects and have even conducted joint military exercises.
It seems like they're playing different roles in this new multipolar world.
Yeah.
China is focusing on economic power, while Russia is emphasizing its military and security capabilities.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
China is building roads, bridges, and ports, while Russia is providing weapons, training, and security services.
Right.
African nations are looking for partners that can meet their specific needs, and they're not limiting themselves to just one option.
So it sounds like they're playing the field, hedging their bets, trying to get the best deals from both sides.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
This new multipolar world creates a lot of opportunities for African nations to assert their agency and pursue their own interests.
Okay.
They're no longer beholden to just one or two global powers,
Right.
and they can leverage these competing relationships to their advantage.
It's a reminder that we shouldn't underestimate the strategic thinking and negotiating skills of African leaders.
Yeah.
They're not just pawns in this geopolitical chess game. They're active players who are shaping the rules and outcomes.
I completely agree. It's a very dynamic and fluid situation,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating to watch how it unfolds.
Speaking of unfolding, we haven't even touched on the fascinating case of Rwanda.
Oh, yeah.
This is a country that has defied expectations and taken a very unique approach to its foreign policy.
Rwanda is a great example of how African nations are charting their own course in this multipolar world. Okay.
They've established strong ties with both the West and the East, pursuing partnerships that serve their national interests,
Right.
regardless of ideology or historical alliances.
It highlights the importance of understanding each country's unique context and motivations.
Yeah,
There's no one-size-fits-all approach to engaging with Africa.
right.
Each nation has its own history, its own challenges, and its own aspirations.
And those aspirations are often complex and multifaceted.
Yeah.
African nations are seeking economic development, security, political stability, and a greater voice on the global stage.
It's a reminder that we need to move beyond simplistic narratives about Africa as a monolithic entity.
For sure.
We need to engage with the diversity of experiences, perspectives, and aspirations across this vast and vibrant continent.
And we need to recognize that the future of Africa is being shaped right now by the decisions being made by leaders,
Right.
the movements of activists, and the innovations of entrepreneurs.
It's a story that's unfolding in real time.
It is. And it's one that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Because what happens in Africa will have ripple effects across the globe.
For sure.
It will impact everything from global trade patterns to climate change mitigation efforts.
It's a reminder that we're all interconnected.
Yeah.
And that the choices we make individually and collectively have consequences far beyond our immediate borders.
This has been a fascinating journey so far, and we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But there's still so much more to explore. We've talked about the historical ties, the strategic motivations, and all the different approaches that Russia is taking to gain influence in Africa.
Right.
But I'm curious about what all this means for, the average person in Africa.
Yeah.
How are their lives actually being impacted by this growing Russian presence?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it's one that often gets overlooked in these geopolitical discussions.
Yeah.
The impact of Russia's involvement varies widely depending on the specific country and the nature of their engagement. In some cases, Russian investment in infrastructure and energy projects can create jobs and improve living standards.
Right.
However, there are also concerns about exploitation, corruption, and the potential for these projects to benefit elites rather than the broader population.
And we also can't ignore the human cost of conflict, especially in countries where the Wagner Group is operating.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we've read reports of human rights abuses and violence against civilians,
Right.
which raises serious ethical questions about the nature of Russia's involvement.
It's important to remember that these geopolitical maneuvers have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Yeah.
We need to be mindful of the potential for harm and hold all actors accountable for their actions.
It's a reminder that we can't just focus on the big picture, the grand strategies and power plays.
Right.
We need to also consider the human impact of these decisions, the lives that are being affected on the ground.
I completely agree. It's about recognizing the agency and the dignity of the people who are living through these changes.
Yeah.
They're not just pawns in this geopolitical game. They're individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and aspirations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Russia's growing presence in Africa,
Okay.
what are some of the key takeaways that you want our listeners to remember?
First, I think it's important to understand that this is not a new phenomenon.
Okay.
Russia has a long history of engagement in Africa dating back to the Soviet era.
Right.
However, their approach has evolved, and they're now using a combination of diplomacy, military power, and economic influence to secure their interests.
And it's not just about Russia acting alone, right?
Right,
We
yeah.
need to consider the role of other global players like China, the United States, and European nations,
Yeah.
all of whom are also vying for influence in Africa.
Absolutely. It's a complex and dynamic landscape with multiple actors and competing interests.
And African nations themselves are not passive bystanders in this process, are they?
No, not at all. They're actively making choices about which partners to align with and how to leverage these relationships to advance their own goals.
We've seen examples of this in countries like Rwanda, which has successfully navigated this multipolar world by pursuing partnerships with both Western and Eastern powers.
Yeah, they're doing a great job of that.
They're demonstrating that it's possible to chart an independent course and pursue a foreign policy that serves their national interests.
It's a reminder that Africa is not a monolithic entity.
Right.
Each nation has its own unique context, its own history, and its own vision for the future.
Right.
We need to engage with this diversity and complexity if we want to understand what's really happening on the continent.
So where do we go from here?
Hmm.
What are some of the key questions that we need to keep asking as this story continues to unfold?
I think it's important to pay attention to how the relationship between Russia and African nations evolves over time.
Okay.
Will it be a true partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefits, or will it become a new form of dependency and exploitation?
And how will the actions of other global powers like China and the United States influence the dynamics on the ground?
Right.
Will we see increased competition and rivalry, or will there be opportunities for cooperation and collaboration?
Ultimately, the future of Africa will be determined by the choices that African nations make.
Right.
Will they be able to leverage these external relationships to their advantage?
Yeah.
Or will they become caught in a new web of geopolitical competition?
These are questions that we'll continue to explore in future deep dives.
For sure.
But for now, we want to hear from you, our listeners.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on this complex and evolving relationship between Russia and Africa?
Yeah, let us know.
What questions are you left with? Share your insights, and let's continue the conversation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope it's given you a better understanding of the forces that are shaping Africa's future.
And remember, this is just the beginning of the story.
Right.
Stay tuned for more deep dives into the fascinating world of global affairs.
Sounds good.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep